Good morning. Today I'm taking you along as I head into southern Alaska looking for adventure. Let's get into it. Since I started this channel, one of the most frequent comments I get are people pointing out the many similarities between me and one of Alaska's most ill-fated adventurers, Chris McCandless. And I mean, it's not a hard parallel to make. I literally quote the guy in my first video. But since then, the reactions I've gotten have been mixed. Some of the kinder comments I get are people warning me not to make the same mistakes and wishing me good luck. And some of the less tactful comments are people telling me that it's stupid to quote him, that he was an idiot who deserved what he got. So I wanted to clear the air on this a bit. I think there's more room for discourse around Chris McCandless than loving him or hating him. And I think there's an angle of what he did that isn't often discussed, and I wanted to talk about it here. But first, to the uninitiated, who is Chris McCandless? To put it very, very simply, Chris was born into a wealthy family on the West Coast, got good grades, went to a good college, and was sort of expected by everyone to be successful, at least by the world's definition of the word. But at 22, he found himself jaded and unsatisfied with the materialistic world that he was a part of. So he donated his life savings to charities, and basically did his best to drop off the face of the earth. For 2 years in the early 90s, he drifted across the US as a vagabond, until he ended his journey in central Alaska, where he died in his iconic bus after 113 days of surviving in the wilderness. The contention of the story of Chris McCandless arises from the circumstances of his death. No one debates that he was vastly underprepared for what he did. He went into the wilderness with little more than a gun, a handful of books, 10 pounds of rice, and a pair of old rubber boots. When most people hear that, especially Alaskans, the general response is something along the lines of he deserved to die, and that he got what was coming to him. He was stupid to believe for even a second that he could survive for any amount of time with such a limited supply. And while that's true, I think there's an angle to what Chris did that a lot of people miss, and I wanted to discuss that with you all. But before then, let's dive into my own story for a little bit. I ordered the last of my lumber the other day. Because I ordered it too late, it won't arrive until next Wednesday. But that newfound time opened up a window for me. I'd been waiting all summer to head down south to Valdez, and after getting my hands on my mother's inflatable kayak, packing my bags, and attending to a bit of car maintenance, I was on my way. I've been formulating a plan for my next adventure for a while, and it seemed that while I had the space before the final push to finish the cabin, there was nothing better to film in that empty space. That first night in Valdez wasn't the best though. It seemed darker than usual. For an ocean town, access to the ocean was pretty limited, and where it wasn't, it was obscenely overcrowded. Late July is the final surge of Valdez's tourist season, and I seemed to have caught it in its peak. But I figured if I slept it off, things would get better in the morning. And after a night in the front seat of my car, the sky seemed more open, the town seemed quieter, and I was ready to embark. Before Chris died, one of the last things he wrote is one of his more quoted pieces of writing, and I think it really illuminates what his thought process was going into that final stretch of his journey. I'll read a piece of it here. And now, after 2 rambling years, comes the final and greatest adventure, climactic battle to kill the false being within and victoriously conclude the spiritual revolution. Now, I understand if you dislike the melodrama that seems almost inherent with that line. I would feel the same, but that quote was never written for us. It was written for him, by him, for him, on a piece of paper that he never had any idea of knowing that it would be published and repeated ad hominem in book after endless book for years after his death. It's very flowery writing, maybe a bit too flowery for most of us, but it's a very, very honest and sincere look into his mindset going into those last days, to kill the false being within. My plan was simple in theory, but in reality I'm sure it would have been much harder to execute. I spent most of the morning looking for good secluded points of ocean access, and when I finally found one, I pulled over, went through my checklists again and again and again, and made sure everything that could possibly be missed was accounted for. I learned a ton from the last trip, and this time I was determined not to miss any component, no matter how minor. One thing I learned from this excursion, though, was that I probably still had too much stuff. I planned to be out there for a day or two, but the kayak was still stuffed pretty tight. I'd fix it all, but the super light camping equipment is obscenely expensive, and I think there are much better uses of my money than a tent that weighs the same as a loaf of bread. I've never in my life seen true ocean. I've been to Valdez a ton, but Valdez is sort of a fjord inlet, and the actual Pacific Ocean is a few miles out of a winding pass through the mountains. So my plan was to kayak along the shoreline, keeping out of open water until I came to the actual shores of the sea. But that expectation for a journey didn't last long. The kayak was leaking air, and the streams I planned to use to get out to sea weren't deep enough. Eventually, when I was getting close to the outlet, the air was low enough that I took on a lot of water trying to get out, and absolutely soaked myself. It was pretty apparent then that this fool's hope of an adventure wasn't going to happen. I had to rethink my trip and come up with a new way to make it worth it. Luckily, that didn't take long. So, that quote from earlier, the climactic battle to kill the false being within, why do I think that line is important? Why does that context matter? People are always kicking the dead horse of Chris being underprepared, but when he was dropped at his destination in late April of 1992, Jim Gallion, the last person to see him alive, offered to take him all the way down to Anchorage, pay out of his own pocket for real survival gear, and bring him back. But Chris declined. Why? Why would he turn down an open and necessary offer for help? I think he declined because that would have defeated the point. He describes his final adventure as a battle, a challenge to overcome. To go into the wild with every piece of equipment and provision that you would need wasn't the point. It was never about making absolutely sure that he would come back alive. It was about testing himself, seeing if he could with what little he had. And though it's easy to forget, he survived with those few provisions for 113 days. That's 3.5 months completely by himself, surviving off the land under his own power until he made the mistakes that took his life. I don't idolize the man, not by any means, but I share a lot of his sentiments, and I appreciate his honesty. I think there is something incredibly admirable about going into the wilderness with the goal of destroying some inauthenticity in yourself, despite the obvious risk. What he did, I think, was a test of will that would have been cheapened by any certainty that he might return, or by tipping the odds in his favor. And that is what I think people miss. I am biased, though, I will readily admit that. I've always been a sucker for the reckless romanticism that drove him north, for the challenging of the world and its institutions in pursuit of a freer, more honest path. It's the same force that drives me, the force that keeps me toiling. I hope for a free life and an honest life, and sometimes that requires risk and sacrifice. But in most cases, I believe that if the gamble pays off, then the risk is well worth the reward. That's why I tempt fate like I do. That's why I even consider going into the sea in an inflatable kayak. That's why I scale 6,000-foot mountains on a whim, because living under a schedule, a clock, or a normal job in a normal world is far more frightening to me than looking at the world around me and challenging it to a fight. That is why I quoted Chris. I'm under no false pretenses about him. He was as much a romantic West Coast fool as he was a martyr for pioneerism. But I respect what he did, the quest he undertook to kill the false being within. That I admire. It's a strange thing to get back to the foot of a range and look back at the summit you conquered, especially if you did it alone. It's a new feeling for me, as in my whole life, I've stood on the summit of a mountain 3 times. But I intend to change that. I have unfinished business here, and there are so many more mountains to climb. That's all I've got for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Mick, and until next time, toil for your food. Have a great night.